January 1991. A small house on Calle Principal in the unincorporated edge of Monterey County, California. A retired teacher named Estelle Briggs sits at her kitchen table with a stack of medical bills she cannot pay. She is 67 years old. She taught third grade at the same elementary school for 31 years. Her husband died 4 years earlier. Her pension is small. Her arthritis has gotten bad enough that she can no longer do the substitute teaching that used to fill the gap. 3 weeks ago, her doctor told her she needs a hip replacement. The number on the estimate sheet has more zeros than her checking account has ever held. She does not have family nearby. Her son lives in Sacramento and has his own mortgage and his own children. She has told no one how bad it has gotten. In 4 days, an envelope is going to arrive at her house with no return address, and what is inside it is going to change the rest of her life. She will never learn who sent it. Here is the story. Estelle Briggs was born in Salinas in 1924. Her father picked lettuce for 40 years in the fields that John Steinbeck wrote about, fields that Estelle herself walked past every morning on her way to a one-room schoolhouse where a teacher named Mrs. Coyne had taught her to read before she was 6. Estelle never forgot Mrs. Coyne. She decided in that one-room schoolhouse, at an age when most children decide nothing more permanent than what game to play at recess, that she would become a teacher herself, and she never wavered from that decision for the rest of her life. She got her teaching credential from San Jose State in 1946, one of the first women in her family to attend college at all. She came back to Monterey County and took a position at a small elementary school in Carmel Valley, and she stayed there for 31 years, teaching third grade, the same age she had been when Mrs. Coyne taught her to read because she believed 8 and 9 years old was the age when a child either decided books were a door or decided they were a wall, and she intended every child who passed through her classroom to find a door. She married a man named Walter Briggs in 1951, a building contractor who specialized in additions and renovations on the older homes scattered through the Carmel Valley and Monterey Hills. They had one son, Thomas, born in 1954. Walter died of a stroke in 1987, suddenly, in the garage of their small house, with a half-finished cabinet door in the vise behind him. Estelle had been a widow for 4 years by January of 1991. She had retired from teaching in 1977 with a pension that had been adequate in 1977 and had grown steadily less adequate every year since, the way pensions calculated decades ago tend to do against a cost of living that does not consult anyone's retirement calculations before it rises. She had picked up substitute teaching through the 1980s to bridge the gap. Her hands had started failing her around 1989. By January of 1991, the arthritis in both hips had progressed to the point where a doctor in Salinas told her, not unkindly but very directly, that she needed a hip replacement within the year, or she was going to lose the ability to walk without assistance altogether. The estimate for the surgery, after her limited insurance contribution, came to just under $11,000. Estelle Briggs had $4,000 in savings. She had a house worth perhaps $80,000 paid off, the only real asset she had, and the idea of taking out a loan against it at 67 years old, with no clear way to pay it back beyond a pension that barely covered her groceries and utilities, was the kind of math that kept her awake staring at the ceiling of the bedroom she had shared with Walter for 36 years. She told no one. Her son Thomas called every Sunday. She told him she was managing fine. She did not want to be a burden to a 36-year-old man with 2 children and a mortgage of his own. She told her closest friend from the school, a retired librarian named Dot Anselmo, only that the hip was getting worse,
not the part about the money.
She had spent 31 years being the person who solved other people's problems in a third-grade classroom, and she had never quite learned how to ask anyone to solve hers. Where are you watching from? Drop your state in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. Clint Eastwood had moved to Carmel by the Sea in stages through the 1970s and 1980s, drawn by the same Monterey Peninsula light that had drawn painters and writers for a century before him. By 1986, he had been elected mayor of Carmel for a single 2-year term, a position he had taken seriously and had used, among other things, to push back against zoning restrictions he believed were strangling small local businesses. He knew the area the way a man knows a place he has actually lived in, rather than simply owned a house in. He drove his own truck to the hardware store. He ate breakfast at the same diner often enough that the waitresses knew his order without asking. He was, by 1991, one of the most famous men in the world. And he was also, in the particular and contradictory way that small towns absorb famous residents, simply a man who lived there, recognized but not treated as an event each time he walked into a room. He did not know Estelle Briggs. He had never met her. He had no connection to her school, no connection to her family, no reason whatsoever to know that a retired third-grade teacher on Calle Principal was lying awake doing arithmetic that did not work. What connected them was a man named Hal Dorflinger, the contractor who had taken over Walter Briggs's old building business after Walter died, and who happened, in early January of 1991, to be doing a small renovation job on a guest cottage at a property near Eastwood's own home in Pebble Beach. Hal had worked for Walter Briggs as a young carpenter in the 1970s. Walter had taught him the trade. Hal had stayed close to the Briggs family in the years since, the way a man stays close to the people who taught him his craft, checking in on Estelle from time to time, fixing the occasional loose step or dripping faucet at her house without charging her for it, because that was a debt he felt he owed Walter, and intended to keep paying in small installments for the rest of his life. On a Tuesday afternoon in early January, Eastwood walked out to the guest cottage where Hal was working to ask him a question about a fence post on the property line. They had known each other for years, the casual acquaintance of two men who lived in the same small peninsula and occasionally crossed paths on jobs. Hal was in a low mood that afternoon, distracted, working slower than usual. Eastwood noticed. He asked if everything was all right. Hal said it was nothing, just thinking about an old friend's widow who was in a tough spot. Eastwood did not press immediately. He asked about the fence post. Hal answered. Eastwood started to walk back toward the house. Then he stopped, the way a man stops when something he heard a moment ago catches up to him a few seconds late. He turned back and asked Hal what kind of tough spot. Hal told him. He told him about Walter Briggs, the contractor who had taught him the trade 20 years earlier. He told him about Estelle, the third-grade teacher who had spent 31 years at the elementary school in Carmel Valley. He told him about the HIP, the $11,000 estimate, the $4,000 in savings, the pension that did not stretch. He told him Estelle had not told her own son the full truth of it, that he, Hal, only knew because he had stopped by to fix a porch light the week before and found her sitting at her kitchen table with the bills spread out, and her face doing the thing a face does when a person has been carrying something alone for too long and has briefly forgotten to hide it. Eastwood listened without interrupting. When Hal finished, Eastwood asked one question. He asked, "Does she have any idea anyone might help her?" Hal said no. He said Estelle Briggs was the kind of woman who had spent her whole life being the helper and did not know how to be the one helped, and that she would refuse outright if anyone offered directly, because accepting charity from someone she knew would feel, to her, like an admission of failure she was not willing to make. Have you ever known someone who needed help so badly and would have refused it the moment it was offered to their face? That is its own particular kind of problem to solve. It cannot be solved with a knock on the door. It has to be solved sideways.
Eastwood thought about this for a moment. He asked Hal whether Estelle had any history of receiving assistance through educational or retired teacher channels, scholarships, grants, anything of that nature that might provide cover for an anonymous benefit. Hal said he did not know, but that the school district had some kind of retired employees association that occasionally did small things for longtime staff, holiday baskets, that sort of thing. Nothing close to $11,000. Eastwood nodded. He said he had an idea and asked Hal not to mention to Estelle that they had discussed it. Not yet. Possibly not ever. Hal agreed. He had known Eastwood long enough to understand that when the man said "not yet" in that particular tone, he meant it, and that pressing for details would not be welcomed. Over the following week, Eastwood made several phone calls through his business manager, a man who had handled Eastwood's financial affairs for over a decade and who was accustomed to occasional unusual instructions that came with the same standing condition attached to all of them, that the source remain untraceable back to Eastwood personally. A small entity was set up, modestly named the Monterey Peninsula Retired Educators Fund, with a post office box in Salinas and a letterhead designed by a local print shop that did not ask questions about clients who paid cash for a single small job. The fund had exactly one purpose and exactly one donor, though nothing on its paperwork indicated either fact. A letter was drafted explaining that the fund, supported by private contributions from Peninsula residents who valued the contributions of longtime educators, had identified Mrs.
Estelle Briggs as a recipient of a one-time medical assistance grant in recognition of her 31 years of service to local school children. The letter specified that the grant would cover the full cost of her upcoming hip surgery, paid directly to the hospital and surgeon, with a modest additional sum included for incidental recovery expenses, transportation to follow-up appointments, in-home help during recuperation. The letter asked nothing of her in return, required no application, and noted that the fund's confidentiality policy meant no further correspondence would be possible regarding the source of the contributions. The envelope arrived at Estelle Briggs's house on a Saturday in late January, 4 days after Eastwood had first heard Hal say the words, "tough spot." There was no return address. Estelle almost did not open it, assuming it was another bill or another piece of the medical paperwork that had been arriving with depressing regularity for 3 weeks. She opened it at the kitchen table, the same table where she had been doing the arithmetic that did not work. She read the letter once. She read it again. She set it down on the table and put both hands flat against the wood, the way a person steadies themselves against a table when the floor has briefly stopped feeling solid. She called Dot Anselmo. She read the letter to her over the phone. Dot was quiet for a long moment, and then said the only sensible thing there was to say, which was that some things in this world simply happen to good people, and that Estelle should call the number on the letterhead to confirm it was real before she let herself believe it. The number connected to an answering service that took a message and returned the call within the hour, confirming the grant, confirming the arrangements with the hospital had already been made, confirming there was no application process because none had been required, the recipient having already been identified and approved. Estelle Briggs had her hip replacement surgery in March of 1991. The surgeon's office confirmed the entire balance had been paid in advance by a third party. She recovered through the spring with the help of a part-time home aide whose modest weekly fee was also, she discovered when she tried to pay the woman herself in May, already covered through the following autumn.
She never learned who funded the Monterey Peninsula Retired Educators Fund. She wrote a thank you letter to the post office box in Salinas. It was never answered, not because no one read it, but because answering it in any personal way would have undone the entire careful architecture of the thing. The fund made one additional contribution to Estelle Briggs's life that she also never traced to its source. In the autumn of 1991, a small grant arrived covering the cost of a stair lift installed in her house, allowing her to continue living in the home she had shared with Walter for 36 years, rather than being forced to consider assisted living as her mobility continued to be limited even after the surgery. The same untraceable post office box, the same modest letterhead, the same absence of any request for acknowledgement. The arrangement continued quietly for 7 years. Not every year involved a major expense. Some years the fund's contact, channeled always through the same anonymous structure, simply ensured a property tax payment was covered when Estelle's pension fell short, or that a particularly hard winter's heating bill did not become the kind of choice between warmth and groceries that elderly people on fixed incomes are sometimes forced to make. Hal Dorflinger, the only living person besides Eastwood and his business manager who knew the truth of where the money came from, checked in on Estelle periodically over those 7 years, ostensibly for small repairs, and reported back, when asked, simply that she was doing all right, that the hip had healed well, that she still gardened, that she still corresponded with several of her former students, several of whom were by then in their 30s and 40s, and still wrote to thank her for teaching them to love reading. Eastwood never asked for more detail than that. He had learned, the way certain men learn, that there is a particular satisfaction in simply knowing a thing is being handled correctly, without needing the granular accounting of exactly how. Estelle Briggs died in her sleep in November of 1997. She was 73 years old. Her son Thomas came down from Sacramento to handle the estate. Going through her financial records, a task that takes on its own particular grief when you are doing it for a parent who has just died, Thomas found 7 years of correspondence from the Monterey Peninsula Retired Educators Fund, carefully organized in a manila folder, every letter, every receipt, every confirmation of a covered expense, kept in chronological order the way a former teacher organizes things, by date, with handwritten notes in the margins documenting her own attempts over the years to learn who was behind it. Thomas had known none of this. His mother had never mentioned the fund to him, not once, in 7 years of Sunday phone calls. He sat at her kitchen table, the same table, and read through 7 years of his mother's gratitude, addressed to a post office box that had been closed for 2 years by the time he found the folder, the fund having quietly wound down its single mission once it was no longer needed. Thomas Briggs spent several months trying, on his own, to learn who had funded the Monterey Peninsula Retired Educators Fund. He found the print shop that had made the letterhead, long since out of business. He found the post office box records, which led to a private mail service that had no obligation and no inclination to disclose its client's identity decades after the fact. He eventually gave up the formal search. What he did not give up was the question itself, which he carried for years, the way a person carries an unanswered debt of gratitude they have no address to send it to. The answer came to him sideways, the way these answers often do. In 2006, 9 years after his mother's death. Thomas had moved back to the Monterey area by then. He struck up an acquaintance with Hal Dorflinger, who was by that point an old man himself, still occasionally doing small repair work around the peninsula out of habit more than necessity. They got to talking one afternoon about Walter Briggs, about the old days of the building trade in Carmel Valley, about Estelle. Hal, who had carried the secret faithfully for 15 years and had never intended to break it, found himself, in the particular loosening that comes with old age and old friendship, and a son finally old enough to be told, saying more than he had planned to say. He did not give Thomas a full confession. He said only, when Thomas mentioned the mysterious fund and his years of fruitless searching, that some debts get paid by people who would rather not be thanked for paying them, and that if Thomas had ever wondered whether there were still men in this world who did good simply because the opportunity to do it had crossed their path, he should stop wondering, because there were, and his mother had been helped by exactly one of them. Thomas pressed him gently. Hal would not give a name. He said only that the man in question still lived on the peninsula, that Thomas had almost certainly seen him in the grocery store or the hardware store at some point without knowing it, and that the man's preference, as far as Hal understood it, was that the help remain attached to nothing but the helping. Thomas understood eventually that this was as much of an answer as he was going to receive, and he made a decision that surprised even himself, which was to stop trying to confirm what he had already in his heart become quite certain of. He had grown up on the Monterey Peninsula. He knew who lived there. He knew who had been mayor of Carmel in the late 1980s. He put the pieces together the way a person puts together a puzzle they already suspect the shape of, and he decided that some puzzles are more respectfully left with their last piece unplaced. He kept his mother's manila folder. He added nothing to it and removed nothing from it. He gave a single interview many years later to a local Monterey Peninsula historical newsletter, doing a piece on quiet philanthropy in the region, in which he described the broad outline of his mother's story without naming anyone, concluding only that his mother had taught third grade for 31 years, believing she was the one giving something to the world, and had died never knowing that in her final 7 years, the world, in the specific and deliberate form of one quiet man who never wanted his name attached to it, had been giving something back. Clint Eastwood never confirmed the story. He was never asked about it directly, because the structure he had built around it was specifically designed to ensure no journalist would ever have the thread to pull. Hal Dorflinger died in 2014, having never told another living soul beyond what he told Thomas Briggs in 2006, and having told Thomas considerably less than the full truth even then. The manila folder of 7 years of letters sits today in a drawer in Thomas Briggs's house in Pacific Grove. He takes it out occasionally. He has never published its contents in full. He believes, as his mother might have believed, that some kindnesses are diminished by being made into stories with names attached to them, and are better left as what they were when they happened, which is simply a woman who needed help, and a man who heard about it from a carpenter fixing a fence post, and decided quietly, without ever intending to be thanked, that he could do something about it. That is the whole of it. And unfortunately, they do not make men like that anymore. If this story reached you, pass it on. Share it with someone who has spent their life giving and never learned how to receive. Subscribe if you haven't yet. There are more stories like this one, and every single one of them deserves to be told.